Hey, good morning, everybody. Welcome back to Law and Legitimacy, where we are once again a duo. And I'm left without the terror of flying solo, without those few moments of mood music to make the transition from my semi-waking morning stuporous coma to trying to rattle on in some semi-coherent fashion, where, as I do, I can kind of take a look at Mike and think, well, he seems to be following me, so I might be making sense. And every now and then he'll interject to save me from myself. Yesterday, you will note there was no such salvation. But welcome back, Mike. I hope all is well, and it's good to see you.
Yeah, glad to be here. And I love the latter half of the stream yesterday in particular. I really liked where you were going with that, and it seemed like just from reviewing the YouTube chat that you had some people resonating with you as well. So don't be too hard on yourself.
Okay, well, that's an occupational hazard. As we only children know, if you're not hard on yourself, especially if you're an only child spawning from parents who had their disagreements and went their separate ways, sometimes you learn that unless you're riding herd on yourself, that herd's going over the edge of the cliff, and you better push yourself because sometimes you don't know who else is out there pushing. But in any case, lots going on in the world today. I know you're fired up about Devin Taylor. Why don't we start with him?
Devin Taylor, that's a nice blend of the stories. We got Devin Archer, but we got
Devin
Jonathan
Archer.
Taylor
Thank you.
first.
Thank you. Yeah, Jonathan Taylor. Sorry about that.
Yeah, we'll start with some sports this morning. This is something that has been cropping up in recent weeks, and I say this is not necessarily Jonathan Taylor, but we talked before about the positional issues within the running back class in the NFL, and the most recent development in that ongoing saga, the tension between NFL teams and their star rock-toting, as it were, athletes, is beginning to come to a head. And this time it's with one of the league's most prominent running backs, but also one of its youngest. This is Jonathan Taylor I have on the screen. He is entering his fourth season in the NFL. He was drafted in 2020 to the Indianapolis Colts in the second round. Now, the interesting thing about Jonathan Taylor, as I was talking to you briefly before the stream started, Norm, is that he is a bit of an outlier when it comes to his peers and colleagues in the NFL academically. So Jonathan Taylor, many people know him for his on-field prowess. He was a dominant force at Wisconsin. He rushed in his 3 years for over 6,000 yards on the ground and 50 touchdowns. He's just prolific. 200-yard game after 200-yard game. He set the New Jersey State high school record his senior season with more than 2,800 yards in a single season. Just prolific athlete, but also apparently, from all accounts, very academically gifted. He was accepted reportedly to both Yale and Harvard and made the decision to attend Wisconsin for obvious reasons for his athletic career. And he earned his degree in the 3 years that he stayed at Wisconsin. So he received his I think it was reported originally that he wanted to study astrophysics, if I'm correct, and was going to break it down into some sort of double major. Obviously, Wisconsin, as compared to Yale and or Harvard, that may have been better suited for him in those respects. Wisconsin didn't offer what he needed, but he, I guess, deferred to a philosophy degree. So he earned a philosophy degree, undergraduate degree, in 3 years. He entered the NFL. And I would say, as someone who watches sports and then participates pretty zealously in the fantasy football world, he came in with a lot of mileage on his tires, as they say, because he had been so highly utilized at the level that he was in his college career. We already know the shelf life of running backs is relatively small, and because of that, my fear in terms of being a fantasy football player was, I don't necessarily want to draft him because he's already got significant wear and tear.
Been banged up, banged on. Yeah.
Right. So, but he has proven people like me wrong. His first few seasons in the NFL have been really productive.
So what was he making in his first contract?
With the exception of last season, he did get hurt and spent some time off the field. But the rookie deals are all preset. And I think this year he is set to make in 2023 something like $10 million this season. And it's all tiered and tranched, as we've discussed before. Now, teams may elect after that fourth season, if they're unable to agree on some sort of extension with that player, they can opt to do what's known as franchise tag, or just tag the player and bind them by right to a 1-year deal, which gives them some additional time to work out some sort of longer term deal, or just find a replacement and then cut them loose to the free market once that year is done. The interesting thing about this, anyone can look into the headlines. I don't want to dive too deep into, the back and forth. Norm, you mentioned Jim Irsay, I think before the stream, the Colts owner, and his words back and forth. But it came out over the weekend that he had requested a trade. He, being Jonathan Taylor, had requested a trade. Now there is basically a disagreement as to his value. He wants more money. He wants to be paid along the likes of the premier running back in the league, Christian McCaffrey, who plays for the San Francisco 49ers, formerly a Carolina Panther, and also a Stanford player. He makes about $16 million a year, which Matthew puts on the screen. He says it boils down to how much better does JT make the Colts? The answer, not much, especially for $16 million a year. I have to agree. And ultimately the Colts drafted with, Anthony Richardson, quarterback out of Florida, who is highly anticipated to be that blend of quarterback, mobile quarterback and arm prowess that we've discussed before, Norm. He broke just about every combine record for the quarterback position this past year that you can imagine. And so highly anticipated addition to the team. Here's the part of all of this that I think is the most interesting and tells a better story. We know that the NFL and the NFL players are bound to what's known as the collective bargaining agreement. And what I've got on the screen here is the most recent collective bargaining agreement, and it is very, very, very long, very, very, very detailed. But the collective bargaining agreement is, the players' union, the Players Association, the Players Union, negotiating with the NFL, the league, and all of its franchises and owners, their rights and obligations as it relates to their employment with the NFL. And, the question that I put on the screen is really where to gear this conversation. And the reason I took the effort to talk about who Jonathan Taylor might be, aside from just a player in a jersey and in a helmet, running the ball for the Colts, is because it was regarded as, among the league, that his disposition was very good and very collaborative and very productive in terms of business dealing with the team. In April or May of this year, very recently, Jonathan Taylor made the decision to switch agents and has now hired none other than what is this guy's name? I've pulled it up on the website here. Malachi Kawa, who doesn't have, this is the NFL Players Association's website. So it's not like the NFL is throwing shade. This is what the NFL Players Association lists as his business information. Certified since 2014. And in that 9-year span has only negotiated 21 total contracts. There's only one of those in the NFL that matters, and that's with a linebacker that is on the Colts team. And likely the reason that Jonathan Taylor was led to believe that he could probably secure the bag, as they say, from the Colts. And that's linebacker Shaq Leonard, who got the highest linebacker deal, I think, a couple of years ago, guaranteeing him somewhere north of $50 million. Linebackers, running backs, very different positions, obviously. But I wanted to point out, this sort of lack of trust in the agency that I harbor. I talked before about the ethical obligations that attorneys owe to their clients to act in their best interest, to be fiduciaries. And this is an NFL agent who's worked with plenty of MMA fighters, has a website, but here is his online persona. This is who we're talking about. And I get concerned about, the outward professionalism of those who are supposedly supposed to be fiduciaries, acting in the best interests of their clients, acting in good faith and acting presumptively with adequate competence to get a deal done. Agents are compensated on a commission basis, Norm. You know this, right? And it seems as though this is more of an opportunistic move from Malachi to persuade Jonathan Taylor to leave his agent on the eve of contract negotiation season, right? Coming into the fourth season, the last year of his rookie deal, trying to interface with the team that drafted him and has cultivated his career thus far, with an owner that's known, not to mention, but I'm going to mention it now, known for paying one Andrew Luck $24 million, even though he wasn't obligated to when Andrew Luck could no longer play in the NFL at all, had made the decision to retire from the NFL. And if you remember, Andrew Luck, prolific quarterback out of Stanford, he was looking like he was going to be a career quarterback in the NFL, future Hall of Famer, forced to retire early due to neck and health related issues. This is the same owner that was willing to do that. And I'm not saying that, that those are apples to apples comparisons, but at least there is a precedent for this franchise doing something on behalf of the player and in good faith before Jonathan Taylor. And what you may not hear and read from any of the fantasy football podcasts or any of the reporters out there is that this flies in the face of the fact that these players, the NFL Players Association, just finished negotiating this collective bargaining agreement in 2020. We're barely 3 years in to this agreement, which runs for a 10-year term, Norm. This goes through 2030. And we are already having issues with individual players who, by all accounts, are exceptional in their own right, having issues following what their body, the NFL Players Association, negotiated for them before this even comes up.
Well,
right?
that's always the problem with the law of large numbers. I mean, most are going to aggregate toward the middle of the bell curve, and they're going to be who are largely the intended beneficiaries of a contract written in general terms for a large group of people. But people at the outliers, the exceptionally bad and the exceptionally good, are either going to be hurt or rewarded. I mean, the exceptionally bad are going to make more than they should because they're going to be carried along by the bell. The exceptionally good and the exceptionally talented probably would be better off without a collective bargaining agreement. And maybe Taylor's paying the price of that. Maybe he's paying the price of that agreement right now. I mean, is it possible that he's not going to be paid at all this year?
Well, it is possible, and here's why. The Colts have publicly stated that they are now exploring putting him on the NFI list, so the non-football injury list, which is part of this collective bargaining agreement, would allow the Colts to basically assign his 2023 contract to the next year, as best I understand it. And that means that if for whatever reason Jonathan Taylor doesn't get his stuff together and he and his agent don't have a round table and a come to Jesus, as I would call it, on the realistic probability that Jonathan Taylor could lose not only just the money he's entitled to this year, should he show up to camp, should he do the bare minimum to perform, but also he's going to lose another precious year of his very short career by positional standards. And this is what it ultimately comes down to. I understand that.
Well, let me play devil's advocate for a minute. Would that year off maybe benefit him, give his body a chance to recuperate some, as long as he stays fit?
We've seen this movie before. The reason the collective bargaining agreement was revised to give teams the ability to assign the contracts to the subsequent year is because one Le'Veon Bell held out several years ago. Right, and made a big stink about it when he ended up coming back to the New York Jets on a new deal, new contract, blah blah blah. The guy looked like mud, right? He was not who he was prior there too. Other positions can get away from stepping away from the game, and we'll see with the likes of Calvin Ridley down in Jacksonville. Calvin Ridley was the receiver that played with the Atlanta Falcons for a couple of seasons and then got popped for the gambling thing and had to sit out the entire last year. He's now with a new team, new deal with Trevor Lawrence, an ascending offense. We'll see how that works, but receivers and running backs are totally different. Like I said, I think that yes, Jonathan Taylor is accountable for making his own decisions. He's a man. I also think that he would be the beneficiary of some really wise, sage advice for someone to say, stop listening to your agent who is really only there to eat off of what you bring to the table. Right.
All those smarts, and he's still making bad decisions, showing that none of us are immune from none of us are immune from folly. And on the topic of folly, I don't know if you're ready to pivot. If you're down in Fulton County, Georgia, and you're in the area of the courthouse, you may be noticing some extra security. That's because Fani Williams is running for governor. Wait a minute, that doesn't make any sense. Security because she's running for governor? Fani Willis, as you know, is the Fulton County District Attorney, and she's getting ready to prosecute Donald Trump
You sound
for.
like a Southerner, fixing to. I'm
I
fixing.
know, I'm fixing to. She's fixing to prosecute Donald J. Trump for his election interference. But I'll speak like a Northeasterner. And she, of course, is not coordinating with Jack Smith. And she, of course, was not making an announcement that her office has been placed on special security measures, while, of course, she was not making that comment while out passing backpacks to children returning to school and answering critics of hers who suggest that by spending all this time trying to build a national profile, she might not be serving the people of Fulton County all that well. No, of course not. She wasn't doing that. But we all know, and I suspect today, candidly, I said this yesterday, I believe it even more today, after working the phones and the internet yesterday with various people down in D.C. covering events. The grand jury will return in Washington, D.C. today. And based on Trump's chatter on Truth Social, based on the gossip in the courthouse and observations that people are making of events down there, it wouldn't surprise me if by 5 p.m. today, the grand jury had voted to indict Donald J. Trump. This under the leadership of the special prosecutor, Jack Smith. And of course, Fani and Jack aren't talking. Of course, they're not coordinating on their events. In Fani's case, who is elected, you get the impression that this is suddenly becoming a campaign event for her. And the highly questionable decision to prosecute on the basis of alternate or so-called fake electors, which we've talked about on this show before, may serve her well as a springboard for national office. She'll become a darling of those who are intent on seeing Trump prosecuted at any cost to the republic. But the notion that somehow she's not talking to Smith, that she doesn't know what he's doing, I get the impression she's acutely aware, or at least she's trying to learn what Smith is doing, and she's acutely aware of every reported move. I'm guessing that Fani Willis pays more attention to what Jack Smith is doing than she does to her spouse, if she has one, because Jack Smith has the capacity to take from her something she wants more than she wants Donald Trump, and that is attention. You don't, as a prosecutor, and this is one of the reasons that, I'm relieved to live in a state where we do not elect prosecutors. In Connecticut, prosecutors are appointed by something called the Criminal Justice Commission, and they sit for 8-year terms, and their terms have to be renewed. They have to submit to renewal by the commission. They don't run for office. They don't preen. They don't put their thumb, whether white, black, Asian, or otherwise, into the air and say, which way do the wind be blowing? And say, I'm going to jump on that bandwagon because that's where the action is. Fani, I'm looking at your picture in the news here, and I'm seeing what looks like a false sense of modesty and a pretend concern with the public good. But it looks to me that you're just no better than the man you're seeking to prosecute. This is a prosecution fueled by an ambition that is blind and heedless to the public welfare. Georgia doesn't need to weigh in on an alternate elector or fake elector theory. And I suspect that while Fani may be able to get an indictment from a grand jury in Atlanta, if she gets a properly instructed jury, may have trouble getting a conviction in this case. In fact, it's arguable that the case ought not to get to a jury at all. As we've discussed at great length before on the show, alternative slates of electors are a standard in American politics. The parties select slates in anticipation of challenges to electoral votes. And it's not at all clear to me that Trump's efforts to influence the selection of electors in Georgia or even the counting of votes broke the law. It is obvious.
And let's not forget that on election night, Georgia was the site of the famous burst pipe, right?
Yeah.
It stopped vote counting at one key location. And you and I, we've discussed not only the Michigan announcement that they were charging that, alternate slate of electors, but we also covered in previous streams the vote totals in Michigan, right? And how Fulton County essentially carried the entire state for Biden.
You
in
know, and I'm glad
contrast
you,
to the balance of the voting counts in all of the other counties. I think it was Fulton County and DeKalb County together that carried the entire state for Biden, and the rest of Georgia on a county by county basis was Trump.
And I'm glad you mentioned that the heavy concentration of votes in Atlanta's urban areas, carrying the entire state, swinging the entire state to Biden, because we suggested something the other day, and we didn't really cover it enough, in my view, and that is this emerging compact between the states to have their electoral votes go to the person who has the most overall popular vote in the national polls. This is a perversion of federalism, and it's a perversion of the Electoral College. Now, some of you may be listening to this and say, well, wait a minute, I don't even know a whole lot about the Electoral College. And shouldn't the person who gets the most vote win the presidency? I don't know that I agree with that. Because if you're in Georgia, for example, and you live in a rural outlying area, why should Atlanta tell you who your representative is going to be for a statewide or a national office? They don't live in your community. They may not share your values. They may be beholden to party machines in locations you don't even visit, don't even care to visit. The purpose of the Electoral College was to assure adequate representation of all people throughout the United States. And it recognized that there would be geographic differences and demographic differences and population-driven differences. And so
Norm, just to say it, I mean, and I go back to this, and I think that this is something that I need to spend more time thinking through how to communicate as effectively and as well intended as I mean it. But when you contrast the voter in the rural area that is perhaps sitting on property ownership, real property ownership with a home, perhaps an acre or more of land, etc., you are really comparing a vote from that person along lines of these more individual First Amendment, Second Amendment, Fourth Amendment preferences, as compared to those who are willingly leasehold voters, as I would phrase them, right? Those that do not participate in real property ownership and who have, to a certain extent, by virtue of living in such dense populated areas, municipal areas, have subverted their Fourth Amendment rights to privacy, and who have foregone the pursuit of property in a respect in exchange for the convenience of being in an urban area with a certain intelligentsia and a certain culture and a certain access to facilities, and convenience for their overall life. Right. And I do think that is not discussed enough, that people who live in cities, who congregate there, and who stack themselves on top of one another. And I'm certainly not trying to be condescending in that respect, but there is a provable observation that in order to be able to exist functionally in these areas, one necessarily submits to unanticipated but routine intrusions on their physical space, right?
Well, you have to. I mean,
on a daily basis, and to that end, you don't really have a balanced voter roll from that. You might have more votes, but you have more votes from people who, as a category, have subverted their own respect for what's contained in the Bill of Rights. I'm
listening to you, and it's a great perspective you bring, and I find it interesting. I'm not so sure I like the use of the word subversion there. It seems to me that the Fourth Amendment, and it seems to me that one way you could tease out. One way a person could tease out what you're saying is a way you don't intend, and that is, well, there should be a property qualification to vote, and there isn't, and there was for quite some time in American history and in the West. But I do think it bears noting that voters in an urban area, where they are stacked, as you put it, on top of one another in a large apartment building, let's say, the residents of one apartment building in the Bronx could contain more, that could yield more votes than all the members in a rural county. And so if we're going to tabulate raw votes on a one person, one vote way, are we saying that apartment dwellers in the Bronx should be telling a person in a rural community in New York how to live, what regulations should be imposed upon them with respect to operation of their car, their motor vehicle, what taxes they should pay, how they should educate their children. And it doesn't acknowledge the fact that people make different choices about how and where to live because those choices reflect their values. Of course, this assumes a voluntaristic fallacy, and that is that everyone just wakes up one morning with equal opportunity to live wherever they so choose. And there's rural and urban poverty, obviously. But historically, many people have flocked to urban areas because they didn't have the opportunities for advancement or support that they had in a rural community. I'm thinking of the move to northeastern cities during the Industrial Revolution, for example. But then the flip side of that is in urban areas, you have people who've developed a habit of dependency because they can't put down roots in their community, and they suddenly become dependent on the hive mind or on political machines or on the tax revenue from people in rural areas. And so you begin to sense real and true regional differences. And I return once again to a discussion of Trump. I'm not seeing in the mainstream media coverage of his rallies. I'm seeing them ignore his rallies. But he's not holding rallies in downtown New York. He's not holding rallies in downtown Chicago. He's not holding rallies in Los Angeles. He's holding them where people live, outside of major cities, and people are responding to him because they're feeling a resonance with what he's bringing to the table. And that resonance, I think, it reflects from a sense of rejection of the values of large urban areas or of coastal elites, in a sense that we're not going to be governed, and we don't want to be governed by standards that spring from a life we don't want to live.
Norm, this is why I said that I really appreciated the last half, or maybe the last third of the stream yesterday, because you talked.
But you're saying the first half and the first 2/3 sucked? Is that what you're saying?
No. I just in particular, because no one that is practicing law is closer to the pulse of what's going on in the January 6 cases than you, and you would be hard pressed to find anybody that would convince me otherwise. But when you were talking about the nature of transhumanism and the emerging threat of artificial intelligence, in particular as artificial intelligence as a mechanism whereby the human soul might be disembodied from its physical corpse, right, from the physical body, and then translating that to, I guess, what I would call a pontification on why Trump might be the felt necessity of our times, the symbol of the defiant man that refuses to be governed by the thread of what we can call that ultimate algorithm, right? This case in Georgia, and us discussing the voter patterns and the voting results on a county by county basis in Georgia, it to me is a great illustration of that proposition that you made yesterday. Right. And when you talk about the mainstream media refusing to give coverage to these rallies, I saw some dolt-like comments in response to you asking this question online yesterday, like, "Oh, they're just not good," or people like that can't be convinced. But I think reasonable people can agree that you are correct in the observation that there is a strategic silence, like almost like a dome of silence over his real life campaigning, his rallies, as compared to how they were covered in previous years. In previous years, they were covered and they were attempted to be sort of, I guess,
minimized. We were all, it became a freak show. Oh, look at those pitiable deplorables.
Those who live in cities.
We need to save them from themselves.
The people that live in cities are closer to being under the thumb of that ultimate algorithm that I think you're referring to. And that maybe that's where you and I coalesce on this issue, is that when we discuss the disparity in voting in urban city centers, where we know that there is a higher dependency on the state for certain standards of living, where we know that there are civil rights groups that depend on the federal dole on an annual basis, and they are not incentivized to solve the problem or problems that they promise to solve, that people in the position of, Fulton County's District Attorney Fani Willis, who's looking to be reelected, she doesn't have an incentive.
Well, I mean, consider this. She's talking about prosecuting Trump while she's out there passing out backpacks to kids getting ready to return to school. I mean, she's becoming a ward healer, and she's cultivating a voter base off an issue that really isn't even part of her bailiwick.
That's right. That's right. Well, and we don't have to beat a dead horse here,
All
but
right.
it is
Yeah,
interesting, and I that's why I say I do encourage anyone who was not able to join Norm for the stream yesterday. It was at noon. Go back and please listen to that. It's great stuff, Norm.
Devin Archer and the Biden brand. The Biden brand. What is Joe? So let me be blunt here. Devin Archer, controversial business associate of Hunter Biden's. He's got federal exposure. He was set yesterday to testify before Congress. The Justice Department made an extraordinary move on Saturday, contacting a judge with supervisory authority over Archer, asking him to require Archer to report to prison on Monday. I can't think of an instance in which a federal prosecutor wrote to a judge on the weekend saying, "Can you make sure this guy gets locked up before Monday morning?" And what other motive could there have been than to keep Archer from appearing before the House, who is investigating Biden and the weaponization of government? A friend of mine from Texas sent me a note yesterday on Archer saying they're not even trying to hide it anymore. And, I had to quickly scramble. What was she talking about? And then I saw this. But then this morning when I followed up on it and I saw your note about it, Mike, I looked to read about Archer's testimony. And to add insult to injury, the Justice Department could not prevent him from going before the House committee. But the House had to hear his testimony privately.
Correct.
I mean, what national security issue did Devin Archer bring to the table other than the fact that Hunter may be selling influence or peddling influence, or pretending at least to have undue influence over his father and acquiring millions perhaps by peddling this illusion, or in fact by peddling that access? Shame on the House of Representatives. This should have been public testimony.
What's in shame in multiple ways, but part of the way that the Democrat side of the political apparatus is defending and dissuading people from believing that this has any merit, which is in this point. And there's a very core reason why I always reference the New York Post when we talk Biden. And it's because the New York Post is the one that brought the laptop story to light. And the New York Post was the one that was censored from the internet almost totally. And the New York Post is the one that compelled 50 different federal intelligence agents, retired and active, to sign a letter saying that the laptop had all the marks of Russian disinformation. And it was the New York Post that even gave us the ability to discuss this right now. So credit to them. Stop doing other dumb bidding, but credit to them. But now what mainstream media is doing, Norm, is saying that if any of this is true, it doesn't matter, because all Hunter did was sell the illusion of access.
The primary
how different than actually selling access.
The primary spokesman for this point of view is Congressman Dan Goldman, representing the 10th District of New York. And people, if you're thinking, Dan Goldman, I know that name. Hey, that mug, I've seen that mug. Yes, he was chief Democratic counsel to the effort to impeach, the first impeachment effort as to Donald Trump. He rode his work on the impeachment of Trump into a congressional seat. And now he's the first person out there saying, this is a waste of the committee's time. We need to move on. He wasn't actually selling access. He was merely selling the illusion of access. Representative Goldman, you're an illusion peddler. Russian interference, does that sell in the 10th Congressional District of New York? I want to press the replay button on what Mike and I were just saying about rural constituents wanting representation. You've been living in the hive so long, you're thinking that hive juice is honey, and you can't get enough of it. Why did we put Goldman in office? Why are we listening to him now? And the reason we're listening is because the anti-Trump narrative strikes a chord. And so Biden suddenly is being defended because Biden and his family and Hunter, because he's the great anti-Trump. A good friend of mine, a former federal prosecutor, Paul McConnell out of Connecticut, posted on Twitter the other day, the only reason the mainstream media and charges keeps attacking Trump and trying to stir people up about Trump. And the only reason federal prosecutors are going after Trump is they realize that by keeping people energized against Trump, they can rally the base of Biden supporters. And that's the only way you're going to get that rickety old man and his team of losers reelected. I don't know that I agree with McConnell necessarily, but it's a thought. And so I think the Biden brand, this begins to look a lot like the Teapot Dome scandal of a century ago. I believe it was under the Harding presidency, where oil reserve rights became, and their sale became a sufficient factor to unseat cabinet members. We should be asking what's going on in Biden land. You know, Mike, you shared a great song with me this morning. And now every time I think of Hunter, I'm going to be thinking of smoking a rock in a crack house, you know?
Yeah, everybody goes. So the song that I shared with Norm this morning was from Frank Ocean's Channel Orange album. And the song title is Crack Rock. And I do encourage anyone listening and thinking about this story to go and just perhaps put that on in the background as you read a New York Post article about the Archer testimony. I'm struck, Norm, by the observation that the mainstream media spent the entire Trump presidency really building up the illusion of some sort of Russia connection and attempting to impeach him on 2 separate occasions. And the entire time, the mainstream media was running cover for the Bidens, right? And now we have the mainstream media on the other side of the exact same scenario, except there is substantive merit to the scenario in this version of events. And so the mainstream media finds itself on the opposite side of the issue.
So what's going to happen in 2024? A few weeks ago, everybody was saying it's going to be Michelle Obama for the Democrats, that the Biden-Trump brand conflict presents us with such a dismal set of alternatives that we need something new to rally behind. Do you buy that? And if so, who is new?
Well, look, man, it's Vivek. I don't know. The only names that I care about at this point in the 2024 election, Norm, are Donald J. Trump and Vivek Ramaswamy. And the more that Vivek talks, the more I like him, which is just such a refreshing concept to me.
Would he run on a Trump ticket, and would that be sufficient to carry independent voters?
Anytime. I don't know. I think that I think the answer is yes. Unequivocally, I think the answer is yes. 37-year-old millennial who is bringing a vision of the common good that has not been pushed into the public consciousness for a term longer than I've been alive. And what he would say, and what he has said repeatedly in answering that question, Norm, is he's focused on winning. And when he is sworn in as president in January of 2025, that he's ready to get to work. So we're not going to get an answer from him saying, sure, I'll be a part of the cabinet. I believe that he's running to win. And I don't know what that means for the oncoming clash between what seems inevitable between him and Trump. But I do know that he's speaking like a winner would speak. And
I mean, you know, he is the most interesting candidate running on the market right now. And every time he does talk, I want to hear more. And I can't say that about many of the other candidates. So let's see what happens. I mean, I have my doubts, about Ramaswamy, on a bumper sticker playing in the middle of the country. I hope we're bigger than that. And I hope that people will give Vivek a listen. But I do think that people minimize, especially in the Northeast. I don't know what it's like out where you are, but I think people in the Northeast minimize Trump's chances in ways that are going to surprise them in 2024. Trump is the candidate of rejection. He is the candidate for people who do not like the direction the country is moving in. He's the candidate for people who say, look, government is necessary, but it's a necessary evil. I don't want government designing a better world. I want government providing the minimal conditions on which I can design a world for myself. Trump is the candidate for people who don't want to be governed, and that's the American experience. And I think he's going to do surprisingly well in 2024, independent of all the various indictments that we bring or that are brought. And I think Jack Smith's J6 indictment will prove to be one of history's great mistakes, because what that's going to do is provoke an even greater legitimation crisis. People are going to say, if it's the rule of law, as applies to Trump in this case, or Trump's rejection of the law's attempt to govern me, I'll choose Trump. And a surprising number of Americans are going to do that, to the shock and despair of right-thinking people on the left. And we're going to be here to tell you about it on a blow-by-blow basis. That music tells me it's time to shut up.
And Vivek,
find a way
it's not time to shut up. Vivek has also said he's maintained that he would pardon Trump on day one should he be elected. Should he be elected president, he doubled down on his promise to pardon Trump for any and all the charges.
Not far enough. Take a look at those J6 defendants. Vivek's sentencing recommendations are coming in the Proud Boys case this week, and although they're confidential and we shouldn't talk about it, probation thinks they should do far more time than any of the lawyers do. The government will file its sentencing memos on August 17th. They will seek an enhancement of those penalties for quote-unquote terroristic activity and expect sentencing recommendations from the government to be in the high teens to low 20s. It's going to put Judge Timothy J. Kelly in an awkward place. How much do you really want to penalize for people who went to Congress one day, went to the Capitol one day to protest, even if their mistake about it or their belief about a stolen election was mistaken? They went, they came, they planned to speak out, they planned to act out, but they didn't plan an insurrection. Everybody knows that. Everybody who paid real attention to the evidence. How much are you going to penalize Americans for caring about their community? Let's find out.
Norm, as always, great to speak with you on these topics. I feel privileged, and I think that our viewers and listeners should feel privileged. Thank you for sharing this with us. And I'm glad to be back, but we'll be back tomorrow at 8 a.m. Eastern time on Rumble Video, YouTube Live, and on X. And you can also find us on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Google Play, Overcast, etc. Find podcasts. Leave us 5 stars or leave us alone, as I say. And Norm, I look forward to continuing with this. We'll see what shakes out of the tree down in Georgia, right? With respect to any forthcoming indictment. I think they've got another 10 or 15 days before they're due to announce charges there. And I don't know if you believe that Jack Smith will, or if anything will be filed pursuant to J6 and Trump before then. But I do.
I think it's this week. I think it's this week.
We'll pick that up as that unfolds. But anyway, find us here tomorrow at 8 a.m. Norm, thank you as always. See you, everybody.
Ciao.